Chris Van Hollen, the Maryland Democrat, top Democrat on the Budget Committee, member of the Biden talks. Thanks for the time. Appreciate it.
Good to be with you, Peter.
In the last 48 hours, we saw Eric Cantor step away from the Biden negotiations. Have we escalated the chance of a U.S. default now?
Well, I certainly hope not, because that would be disastrous for the American economy and all the people who are still looking for work. It would just compound the difficulties we already in. In fact, it would make the last recession look like a modest downturn. So it's very important that we come together and get this done. You know, Speaker Boehner called for an adult moment. We don't think it's an adult moment to be walking away from tough decisions.
Eric Cantor, Republicans have suggested, listen, what we're essentially doing here is cutting to the chase. This is a deal that has to be negotiated by the president, by Speaker Boehner ultimately, and that's what's happening here. They're speeding up the process.
Well, look, what happened is the Republicans originally introduced a budget that ended the Medicare guarantee and gave folks at the very top of the income scale, millionaires, a 30% tax break. That was their priorities. Now they've said they want to impose those priorities essentially on the debt, on raising the debt ceiling and preventing a default. That's what took us to these negotiations. It's important that we sort out these issues one by one, and running away from tough issues is no answer to our problem.
Let's talk about the tax increases that you all have at least put on the table in the course of these negotiations. What are they? Give us a better sense what it is you're hoping for and what it is Eric Cantor has rejected.
Well, we're somewhat limited in going into all the details, but some of them have become public. Clearly, we said you got to get rid of the taxpayer subsidies for the oil and gas industry, corporate jets, but we talked about other things. For example, for very high income individuals, we talked about beginning to phase out some of the tax deductions and preferences, keep the rates exactly where they are. And if you do it the way we proposed, you would actually give tax relief to more people than would see a higher effective tax burden, because it deals with what is currently in the tax code. This is how you limit the number of deductions that you're allowed to take. And so between around incomes 170,000 and 200,000, those people would actually not have the limitation that's currently imposed on them, but over $500,000 we're talking about. That's an example. I mean, there are others. But I've heard the word out there that, you know, what the Democrats have put on the table in terms of closing tax loopholes and addressing the issue of exemptions isn't sufficient to be meaningful. That's just not the case. We put some significant, meaningful proposals on the table, and they did not raise rates. They took the approach that the bipartisan commissions have recommended.
What about going over after some of the business tax breaks that are on the books? You mentioned oil and gas, but what about some of the other ones? Deferral? How about that?
Well, we've certainly looked at deferral in the past because we want to stop rewarding companies for shipping jobs overseas. We think we should be shipping American products overseas. But we haven't been demanding that. And here's the point. We have a menu of options. Tell us which ones you hate the least. Tell us which ones you're willing to support in the interest of getting down the deficit and having a balanced approach and not having to squeeze Medicare and important health programs. Just tell us which corporate tax breaks you're willing to begin to close so that we don't have to squeeze seniors on Medicare. That's the question.
How worried are you that Speaker Boehner, even if he can cut a deal with the president, is going to come back here and not get the support of his own Republican troops? Ultimately, can he deliver Republicans? Are you confident he can?
Well, this is a moment of leadership. I'm not talking about any individual, but on the Republican side, on the House and the Senate, this is the time to say, look, we really are worried about the deficit. In fact, we're more worried about the deficit than we are about Grover Norquist or what he's going to say. Because the reality is $1 in closing a loophole or taking away $1 of taxpayer subsidies from the oil companies or other, folks who have very powerful lobbyists in Washington is $1 that we can commit to reducing the deficit. We've said we're willing to make some tough cuts. I mean, absolutely, cuts have got to be a part of it. In fact, as the president said, it's the great majority of it. But you can't do this in a balanced way, in a responsible way, without also addressing the issue of closing some of these loopholes and dealing with revenue. And that's not just me. That's every bipartisan group that's looked at this.
Let me just ask you finally, what are the chances we're looking at a temporary solution or a stopgap measure that extends the debt ceiling, perhaps $1 trillion in spending cuts? Are we looking at a short-term deal here?
I think that's a mistake for the economy. In other words, I think that just continues the kind of uncertainty about this very important question. And what we really want is to send a signal that we're willing to get our fiscal house in order, and we're not going to do this in a herky-jerky way where we're facing these kind of deadlines every couple months.
Right. Congressman Chris Van Hollen, member of the Biden talks, Democrat on the Budget Committee. Mark, we'll send it back to you, the latest here, the budget situation in Washington.
All right, Peter Cook, Congressman Van Hollen, thank you both.